The Peninsula by Mark Nesbitt. In the spring of 1862, the Virginia Peninsula was central in Union General George B. McClellan's plan to strike at Richmond and end the war. He would land an amphibious force at the tip of the peninsula and march his army straight towards the Confederate capital. The campaign was the largest and most intricate of any campaign to that point in American military history. Assembling a flotilla of 389 ships on March 17th, McClellan began transporting his army over 3 weeks down the Potomac River and from Alexandria to the Chesapeake Bay, disembarking at federally held Fort Monroe. Once he began the overland part of his campaign, he realized that the roads in the part of Virginia were not going to cooperate with his plan of rapid marches towards Richmond. The rural dirt roads soon became quagmires for the heavy use and army demand. Mud sucked at the shoes of the men and bogged down the artillery. As he advanced up towards the peninsula, he ran into the Confederate fortifications along the Warwick River near Yorktown, the old Revolutionary War siege site. His scouts and officers reported some 100,000 rebels in those works, which extended from the York to the James River. McClellan decided they were too strong to take by assault and began planning a siege. Little did he know that he had been the victim of a Confederate ruse. Confederate General John B. Magruder commanded only 13,000 men to man the Warwick defensive works, but marched them around in full view of McClellan's scouts so that they counted the same rebel soldiers over and over again. McClellan, taking time to bring up and mount his heavy guns for the siege, gave Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston time to bring his troops from above Richmond to support Magruder. By the end of April, McClellan's siege lines were ready. On May 4th, after a heavy nighttime bombardment from the Confederates, Union skirmishers inched forward in silence and made an incredible discovery. The Confederates were gone. It had been Johnston's plan to withdraw from the Warwick line because of its vulnerability to flank fire from Union gunboats on both the York and the James. As well, he wanted to establish a defense closer to the capital within supporting distance of other Confederate forces moving toward Richmond's defense. As Johnston retreated, Union troops attacked his rear guard at Fort Magruder and fought in the streets of the old colonial capital of Williamsburg. In the meantime, thanks to the Union Army's advance up the peninsula, the Federal Navy was sailing up the James River toward Richmond. As Confederates abandoned the eastern peninsula, Gosport Navy Yard was also given up, and the famous Confederate ironclad Virginia, the U.S. Navy ship Merrimac, captured and converted to ironclad, which had terrorized the Union fleet since March, had to be scuttled, freeing the James to U.S. gunboats. The danger to Richmond from naval bombardment was clear, and while telling the populace to remain calm, politicians sent their own families inland. Frantic Confederate sailors sank obstructions in the river, but by 7:30 a.m. May 15th, the Federal flotilla rounded the bend and engaged with Confederate artillery on Drury's Bluff. After 3 hours of plunging artillery fire and sharpshooters picking off sailors, the gunboats retired. Richmonders rejoiced. But there was still the threat of McClellan's land force advancing up the peninsula. On May 16th, Johnston established battle lines at a crossroads called Seven Pines using the Chickahominy River, which was prone to flooding into a swamp as part of his defense. Though Johnston had spent the previous 3 weeks withdrawing, he had in mind the strategy to draw McClellan further from Fort Monroe. Should the Yankees be defeated, they would have a long retreat, dogged every step of the way back to the peninsula by the Confederates. Meantime, Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry was making swift marches up and down the Shenandoah Valley, covering some 600 miles and engaging the enemy in 5 pitched battles. His actions accomplished what the Confederate High Command wanted. Jackson drew Union troops away from McClellan's threat to Richmond. By the end of May, McClellan had established a base of supplies at White-House Landing on the Pamunkey River, a tributary to the York and railhead for the Richmond and York River Railroad. In order to protect this base and attack Johnston, McClellan had to stretch his army across the Chickahominy, effectively splitting it before the enemy. As long as the river remained low, both wings could support one another via the few bridges across the river. Johnson realized that, at least south of the Chickahominy, he outnumbered the Federals significantly. On May 31st, he attacked. The 2-day Battle of Seven Pines, called Fair Oaks by the Federals, was complicated by the torrential rain the night before the battle and by confusing Confederate orders that were altered by subordinates before the battle had begun. Nevertheless, the Confederates stopped the Yankee movement on Richmond for the first time, but with a cost. Some 6,100 Confederates and 5,000 Federals became casualties in the battle. One significant Southern casualty was their commander, Joseph E. Johnston, who was wounded. President Jefferson Davis sent Robert E. Lee to replace him and command the army in the field. Lee immediately ordered the fortifications around Richmond to be strengthened and had his men dig in whenever they halted. There was concern that he might not be aggressive enough to command an army in the field. However, his actions and first decisions upon consulting with Davis was to attack the Yankees. McClellan, on the other hand, had halted his offensive of the Peninsula and called on Washington for more troops. Though 30,000 were sent by mid-June, he felt he needed more. Lee also needed something more: information. He sent his 29-year-old cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, to locate McClellan's right flank. Once he found it, Stuart realized that the Union cavalry was expecting him to return the way he had come and was organizing to stop him. Instead of retracing his footsteps, he rode completely around the Federal army and returned to Lee, his command virtually unscathed with the information he needed. Lee met with his generals, including Stonewall Jackson, who rode 50 miles ahead of his own men. The council decided that the attack would begin on June 26 when Jackson's men arrived. Jackson then returned some 40 miles to his columns. The Confederate attacks would shift from east of Richmond to north of the city near Mechanicsville. Union troops were dug in behind Beaver Dam Creek, and after awaiting for Jackson to attack all the morning of June 26th, A.P. launched his division at the Federals. The result of Confederates assaulting the entrenched position were horrifying. 1,500 Southern casualties to only 360 Federal. Though McClellan reported a complete victory, he began a retreat to high ground near Gaines' Mill, 4 miles to the south. He couched his moves from then on as a change of base from White-House on the Pamunkey River to Harrison's Landing on the James. On June 27th, Lee attacked him at Gaines' Mill. Jackson again was not his aggressive self. A.P. Hill fought nearly alone. Throughout the hot afternoon, Confederate assaults were uncoordinated. Late in the day, John Bell Hood and his Texans finally broke through the Union line, but Yankees arriving from across the Chickahominy plugged the gaps and acted as a rear guard. The Federals continued their retreat toward the James, leaving some 6,800 casualties. Confederates again on the offensive suffered more than 9,000 casualties. The armies fought again on June 29th at Savage's Station, a depot to which the Federals had brought some 2,500 wounded for evacuation. The battle began at 9 a.m. in a peach orchard on Allen's Farm, about 2 miles west of Savage's Station on the Richmond and York River Railroad. Confederates brought up a 32-pounder Brooke naval rifled cannon mounted on a railroad card with sloping sides for armor and lobbed shells at the Yankees. The infantry fighting approached a ferociousness that compared to any battle in any theater of the war. The 5th Vermont Infantry, in only 20 minutes of fighting, lost over half its numbers. But again, the Yankees escaped Lee's grasp. On June 30th, Jackson passed Savage's Station and was ordered by Lee to continue the pursuit of McClellan's retreating columns, although McClellan was no longer with his army. After placing 7 divisions around the Glendale crossroads and issuing vague orders to protect the intersection while the rest of the army retreated, he took a skiff out to the gunboat Galena and spent the rest of the day and part of the next ostensibly trying to find a safe place for his army to occupy. He, in essence, left his army without a head for 2 days while vital rearguard battles took place. When Jackson found the bridge on his route through White Oak Swamp destroyed, the fight at White Oak Swamp became predominantly an artillery duel, with Jackson unsuccessfully attempting to find an alternate route through the morass. Again in the campaign, Jackson demonstrated an uncharacteristic lack of initiative, which allowed the Federals to successfully protect their army on its retrograde movement and prevented Jackson from connecting with the rest of Lee's army at Galena. Glendale, about 2 miles west of White Oak Swamp, was fought to protect an intersection that proved vital for McClellan's retreat. Confederates under James Longstreet seemed to realize that the place was tactically important and launched themselves recklessly at the enemy. The rebels at first were successful, but Union counterattacks stabilized their lines. The battle became a seesaw affair. Alabamians captured a 6-gun battery from Federal forces. Infantry and the angry Federal gunners recaptured it in hand-to-hand fighting. The Virginians retook the guns in more savage fighting. The fighting cost the Confederates some 3,600 casualties, and the Union forces lost 2,800, but successfully defended their retreating army. By the next day, July 1st, Lee realized that McClellan's army was nearly to the James, where the Navy's gunboats could help protect it. By the time the Army of Northern Virginia was prepared to attack, McClellan's army was in a nearly perfect defensive position on top of a broad plateau near the James called Malvern Hill. 3 steep sides funneled any Confederate attack onto a plain swept by artillery lined up almost wheel hub to wheel hub. The gunners were supported by 18,000 infantry. Worse for the Confederate attackers, they were within range of the huge naval guns firing from the James River. One Confederate general realized the danger. A.P. Hill, whose men had done the lion's share of the fighting on the peninsula so far, cautioned against an assault. But Lee, whom the army once thought defensive-minded, and Longstreet, who would later gain the reputation of being reticent to attack, personally scouted the terrain and felt that they had found some good artillery positions for their gunners to neutralize the Federal advantage and allow for a frontal assault. The attacks were to be preceded by the artillery bombardment, but the guns were spread out along the road back to Glendale as the army marched to Malvern Hill. Not enough artillery arrived on the battlefield, and the preliminary bombardment never happened. Instead, the few guns that arrived were quickly put out of action by the more numerous Union cannons. Confederate infantry advanced against massed Federal artillery firing canister, anti-personnel rounds of small iron and lead balls encased in tin, which disintegrated upon firing and turned the cannons into giant shotguns. and case shot, which exploded into fragments above the attackers like large, long-range hand grenades. Worse, the Confederates never launched a coordinated massed attack. The small, piecemeal attacks were easily driven back by the Northern gunners, leaving the torn, bloodied bodies of rebels strewn across the plain. Yet more Confederate assaults continued, the attackers leaping over the bodies of the fallen, soon became casualties themselves. The infantry of Confederate General D.H. Hill, who had warned of attacking Malvern Hill earlier, suffered some of the most horrendous casualties. The 3rd Alabama, one of John B. Gordon's regiments, in just 15 or 20 minutes had lost more than half of its men along the attack route. Attack after attack continued, but only one Confederate assault ever threatened the Union line. Darkness brought an end to the horrific slaughter. The results of the 7 days' battles for the Confederacy were bittersweet. Richmond was saved, but at a cost of nearly 20,000 casualties, highly visible, lying in the churches, public buildings, and private homes of the capital. While McClellan lost some 15,000 men, his Army of the Potomac was far from destroyed or demoralized, and he began plans to resume another offensive as soon as Washington would send him more men. It was a refrain they had heard all too often in the federal capital. McClellan's army was ordered to evacuate the peninsula, and by mid-August, ships had brought him and his army back to Washington to fight on the battlefields of northern Virginia. Peninsula Ghosts of Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe on Old Point Comfort, at the eastern end of the Virginia Peninsula, was built on the site of the 1609 Fort Algernon and has been occupied and garrisoned longer than any other post in U.S. Army history. Some of America's most prestigious military men have served there or were imprisoned there. The fort was designed by an aide to Napoleon I, and construction was partially supervised by Robert E. Lee, and mostly completed by 1834. In March 1862, soldiers at Fort Monroe watched with great interest the ending of an era of naval warfare when the Confederate ironclad Virginia destroyed or damaged a number of all-wooden vessels, then herself was stopped the next day by an odd-looking, turreted iron ship named Monitor. Standing on the parapets today, one can watch yet another era in naval warfare pass as nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers steam out to sea. With all that history, it would seem natural or supernatural that ghosts would choose to remain and haunt the historic fort, and indeed they do. Quarters Number 1. Jane Keene Polonsky and Joan McFarland Drum collected some of the stories in the Ghosts of Fort Monroe and have documented several sightings. Old Quarters Number 1 seems to be where some of the more famous ghosts appear. Originally built for the Commandant, it has been the quarters for visiting presidents such as Andrew Jackson, Franklin Pierce, and Abraham Lincoln. Future Confederate President Jefferson Davis stayed in the quarters when he was U.S. Secretary of War, and future President Ulysses S. Grant resided here as a general while he planned the climactic campaign of the Civil War. The tunnels in the lower floor of the house were rumored to be used by escaping slaves during the antebellum years. The sounds of shuffling feet are attributed to these slaves, still trying to find their freedom decades after it was won for them and decades after they've died. Other sounds of boots and the rustle of crinolines are commonly heard in the Quarters Number 1. One resident, after trying to sleep through a night of the sounds of a distant party, complete with boot steps and swishing silk, came down to find fresh flower petals on the hall floor beneath the stairs. The guest was confounded by the fresh flowers, since it was the season of winter. Some poltergeist activity has also been reported. Lights will go on and off of their own accord. Cupboard doors will open and slam shut, and the water will be turned on, all accomplished by unseen hands. The ghosts of Lincoln and Grant. And there are reports of the rarest kind of ghostly encounter, the visual apparition. Who is it that has been seen? Abraham Lincoln, whose specter has most often been observed and documented in the White House, apparently will appear at his own whim in the quarters number 1. He reveals himself in the former guest room, now named the Lincoln Room, wrapped in a casual dressing gown near the fireplace, engrossed in the weighty problems of a country at war with itself. Perhaps he is reenacting in spirit form his visits to Fort Monroe during the ironclad crisis of 1862 and during the Hampton Roads Peace Conference of 1865. Both were fraught with tension, and Lincoln, no doubt, expanded a great deal of emotional energy, perhaps still trapped within the building during both periods. General Grant, though characterized as one who was incredibly cool in battle and under fire, must have somehow left his imprint in quarters number 1, because his phantom has also been seen within the confines of the historic structure. Varina Davis. After his capture in 1865, Confederate President Davis was imprisoned in a casemate within the walls of Fort Monroe. To add insult to injury, the former chief executive was shackled, a fate more common to assassins and blackguards than the head of state of a country. Following him to Fort Monroe was the former First Lady of the Confederacy, Davis's wife Varina. While at the fort, she may have dwelt for a while in the quarters directly across from the casemate where her beloved husband was imprisoned. It is no wonder, then, that, late at night, some who have passed the quarters have seen a second-floor window with the figure of a woman peering out the casemate across the street. Others who have stayed in the quarters where Mrs. Davis was housed have reported some strange, unexplainable occurrences as well. A woman who was staying in the bedroom of the building awoke one morning to see the figure of a woman and a little girl gazing out the window towards the casemate. She arose, crossed the room to the woman, and attempted to touch her antiquated hoop skirt. As she did, the two vanished. Is the specter at the window Varina Davis? After lobbying the powers that be incessantly, Varina got her husband moved from the primitive cell in the casemate to another quarters, Carroll Hall, where she and their daughter Winnie and her sister Margaret Howells stayed for the remainder of his imprisonment at Fort Monroe. Author Polanski and Drum speculate that while Varina Davis never lived in the building where the female ghost at the window is seen, she may have visited there. The White Lady of Ghost Alley. There is no speculation as to the existence of an area in the fort called Ghost Alley, so named since the Civil War, or the specter that has been seen here for more than a century. She has been called by eyewitnesses the White Lady, or sometimes the Light Lady, because some people say she glows. The description remains remarkably the same after so many have seen her. The story of how she became a ghost is an old one. She was far younger than her officer husband. A much younger officer, recently transferred to the fort, caught her eye, and they began an affair, meeting most often in the dark alleys behind the quarters. Her husband was called out of town on an assignment, but returned unexpectedly to find the two young lovers together in the act. He shot and killed his wife, but the young officer made his escape, never to be seen again. So today, when they walk along Ghost Alley, passers-by keep an keen eye out for a hazy, floating mist that seems to glow from within, searching, apparently, for the lover she lost along with her life. The end.